A bitter cold descended upon the South this week as Ohio State won the national championship. The second straight year the SEC was not represented in the national championship game. How does the SEC get back on top, and where does Alabama fit into that mix? We'll discuss today on this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer with you as always. Joining me today is Chase Goodbread. He's a columnist from the Tuscaloosa News, friend of the podcast. Heard from Chase, I believe it was last month. Joined us around playoff selection time. We figured we'd bring him back in today to take a look ahead to Alabama's offseason, and we'll also take a look back on the college football playoff that was. So, Chase, Alabama, year one under Kalen DeBoer. How would you kind of tie a bow on what this season was, and how would you maybe grade the debut for Kalen DeBoer?
I'm not sure a bow can stay tied on it, to be honest with you, the way it did, Blake. Rough year by Alabama standards for sure. 4 losses, not something Alabama fans are at all used to. It's been 2007, which was Nick Saban's first year as coach, was the last time Alabama lost 4 or more in a season. So, rough go. Didn't make a 12-team playoff after a predecessor made a routine of reaching a 4-team playoff. So not a great look for Kalen DeBoer in year one. A lot of factors went into it. To me, he's not to be judged nearly as much in year one as he will be in year two. There were definitely some factors working against him, some of which are typical of in any coaching transition, but not what Alabama fans wanted for sure. They wanted to get into that 12-team playoff. It did not happen with 3 losses, and one of them a blowout to Oklahoma late in the year. Alabama put itself in the position of being left out, and it didn't sit well.
You know, bowl games, as we all know, don't really carry much meaning anymore. They're sort of glorified exhibitions that keep us from watching Hallmark movies around the Christmas season, right? And yet, nonetheless, I expected Alabama to come out and look good and finish strong against Michigan. I mean, I thought, okay, Jalen Milroe is playing. He wants to go out with a bang here. I was pretty floored by how bad Milroe looked in that game, how bad Alabama looked. I know there was some weather in that game. I mean, what was it like for you taking that in? I mean, did that sort of come out of left field, or in some ways did you expect it at all?
No, I didn't expect it. The main reason it came out of left field for me is because Michigan had opt-outs and Alabama didn't.
Right.
You look at what Michigan lost to guys going to the draft. They lost Graham, the big defensive tackle, lost 2 or 3 defensive linemen that played a lot of football for the Wolverines to draft opt-outs. Lost Will Johnson at the cornerback spot, one of the best corners in the country. He decides to opt out. The tight end who led that team in receiving, and by the way, it wasn't a great passing Michigan team to begin with, he opts out. So, when you look at the talent that Michigan had when it beat Ohio State, that it did not have against Alabama, and then, of course, Alabama managed to – now, there were some transfer losses for Alabama, obviously, so it's not to say Alabama's roster was intact. A lot of guys hit the portal, but not NFL caliber opt-out guys like Michigan had. And so based on that, I was expecting Alabama to win that game by double digits, and they just came out as flat as they could come out offensively. Defensively, I think they held up as well as could be expected, considering Alabama couldn't get out of its own way offensively, turn the ball over so much, especially in the first half. But just a total mess on offense. No other way to look at that.
With Jalen Milroe now heading to the NFL draft, I mean, one of the biggest, I think, offseason storylines, not only at Alabama, but in the SEC at large, is what becomes of Alabama's quarterback situation. Do you think they should have tried to land a transfer quarterback? And maybe they tried, but I guess, do you think they should have landed a transfer quarterback? How comfortable do you feel about the in-house options versus trying to go out there and supplement it with maybe someone a little more proven out of the portal?
And for as long as Ty Simpson has been on campus, I've not seen enough of them on the field, especially in moments that matter, that allow me to judge them one way or the other. I mean, the only way I can see it is that the coaching staff likes what they've seen from them in practice. Otherwise, they would have gone to the portal and gotten a quarterback. So, from that perspective, I think it's a showing of confidence in Simpson that the coaching staff watched Dylan Lonergan transfer out to go to Boston College and did not bring one in from the portal. Of course, they did sign a big-time quarterback in the freshman class, which you would expect Kalen DeBoer to do regardless of the quarterback situation. Keelan Russell is his name, one of the top quarterbacks in the country, and he'll be competing with Simpson and Austin Mack. That's kind of what the competition looks like. But, yeah, I think the coaching staff likes Simpson, or else we'd have seen another quarterback come in.
This might be unfair, but when a guy's been in the program for as long as Simpson has, I mean, next year will be his fourth year in the program and hasn't broken through and claimed that starting job, I just start to get a little skeptical about those guys. I mean, we do occasionally see guys that are late bloomers or that stick around in the program for a while. Carson Beck kind of comes to mind. He was a backup for multiple years at Georgia. And then, last season was his better year, first year as a starter, finally gets his opportunity to be a starter, and he had a big year. But, the fact that Simpson's been in the program for 3 years, some people could see that as an asset. I just look at it as like, well, if he was the guy, why hasn't he broken through yet? And also, and again, this might be unfair too, but I think back to his opportunity he had going back to that 2023 season, when there was a little waffling between Nick Saban and Tommy Rees over what to do at quarterback after the Texas loss. Simpson gets his opportunity against South Florida, and it didn't look particularly good in that game. And so, it seems like he's the guy to beat, right? But I mean, do you think it's fair for me to have this level of skepticism for a guy that's in year 4 in the program? And I'm just wondering, like, why hasn't he broken through yet?
Blake, let me tell you an ancient story about an old guy named Mac Jones.
That's a good one. Yeah.
I mean, that was only 4 years ago, and he was Mr. Wait Your Turn, right?
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think it speaks to Simpson or anybody's inability that you've been around and haven't been able to break through, especially at the quarterback position, where to me it kind of clicks or it doesn't. Sometimes it takes the right offensive coordinator being in there. Sometimes it takes a private coach maybe changing or what have you, and the light comes on, right? It's mental for quarterbacks to a large extent. So it's not going to shock me if Ty Simpson comes out and plays well. Now, if he comes out and plays poorly, then we could end up revisiting this conversation for sure. But I think it's wait and see on Simpson. I mean, look, at the end of the day, if he is able to protect the ball, keep the interceptions and fumbles to a minimum, which is a small ask of any quarterback. It's a basic, foundational, fundamental ask of any quarterback. If he's able to do that, he's got a big jump on Milroe in terms of improving the position already just with that, because turnovers were a serious problem with Milroe, throughout his 2 years as a starter. So I think if you're Ty Simpson, it's got to start there. And if you can at least do that, then you've at least got 1 foot step forward already.
Yeah, great point with Mac Jones. It feels like the just a totally different era of college football now, right? It's just like there was pre-2021 and then post-2021, and obviously great weapons around him, but he was phenomenal in that 2020 season for Alabama after, as you said, waiting his turn for a couple years before that. But, within the SEC, so much has been made about it being a down year for the conference. I guess my take on the situation was, if you look at the 8th best team in any conference, I think the SEC was still the best league. I think the SEC's 8th best team this year, whoever that was, your classic middle of the pack team, I would probably take that team against the 8th best team from any other conference. But the college football playoff and national championships aren't about which conference has the 8th best team. It's about who's the best team in college football, who's the creme de la creme. And the SEC didn't have that in spades the way that they've had for most of the previous 2 decades, really. Up until these last 2 years where the Big Ten went back to back, the SEC had ripped off 14 national championships in a 20-year span. So, and Alabama was a huge part of that, though. And so when it comes to like getting an elite team so the SEC can kind of get back to the mountaintop, like how much of that do you think falls on Alabama? Because when we think about this dominant run that the SEC had, like, yeah, it was conference wide, but Alabama was responsible for about half of that. So you take them out of the mix and it looks a little bit differently.
Yeah, the dynasty's over with Alabama, no question about it. There's a climb back, and Alabama's got some clawbacking to do if they're going to get back in the national championship picture. In terms of talents, first and foremost, it's just not quite what it was in Saban's heyday. But, Georgia's won a couple of national titles real recently, darn near won 3 in a row. I think that program is still I think that program's capable of carrying the mantle. Texas comes in and obviously made a big splash in year 1 in the SEC. Until something convinces me otherwise, to me, those are the top 2 programs in the country, and going forward, no reason to think they won't be as good or better than any other conference's top 2. And to your point about depth, just for fun, Blake, while you were talking there, I pulled up my final SEC power rankings for 2024, published on December 1. So this would have been end of regular season, but before the SEC championship game. And you were talking about whoever the 8th best team in the league might be. My final power rankings tabbed a 9-3 Missouri team, 8th in the league. So there you go.
Okay. And Missouri comes out and beats Iowa in their bowl game, who I don't know, was probably around 8th best team in the Big Ten, or maybe even a little better in the Big Ten. Yeah, somewhere probably in that 7 or 8 range for the Big Ten. So there we go. Missouri vindicates the conference in some way. While the league did not perform well in the playoff and didn't get to the championship, Missouri's is holding the torch up for the SEC. So.
Tells you all you need to know, doesn't it, Blake?
That's right. Maybe that's the indictment on the league right there. What's the mood, Chase, around the Iron Bowl rivalry right now? Because, I mean, the Hugh Freeze experience at Auburn has gotten off to a slow start, to put it mildly. I think with this recruiting class that Auburn signed, in addition to bringing in Jackson Arnold, the transfer quarterback from Oklahoma, and hoping that maybe he can reboot his career at Auburn, it seems like Auburn fans, at least from what I hear, you're closer to the situation, but from what I hear, like they're not totally out yet on the Hugh Freeze experience. But this year was not, not a great sign. It's 2 in a row now. And then obviously, as we've discussed, down year for Alabama. So like kind of on both sides of that rivalry, is sort of what's the mood of the state? What's the mood on each side of that Iron Bowl rivalry right now?
Well, certainly the pressure is always on the coach who just lost it, right? Mm-hmm. So, as far as Alabama is concerned, just to start with the Alabama side of it, the Crimson Tide fans are far more concerned about going up about who's ahead of them on the ladder than who's behind. Right. Which kind of fits in with the whole little brother mentality that's always kind of been present in that Iron Bowl rivalry. It's not to say that Alabama fans don't get their share of consternation when it comes to Iron Bowl week, but it's a better program than Auburn right now. And if Kalen DeBoer keeps it trending, is able to get it trending up, then it should stay better than Auburn. And so from the Auburn perspective, yeah, you lose that game, no matter who you are, there's extra heat on the coach. No question about it. It would have been a disaster for Kalen DeBoer if he'd have lost his first Iron Bowl at home and made it a 5-loss season instead of 4. It would have been bedlam in Tuscaloosa, no doubt. But from Auburn's standpoint, yeah, the Hugh Freeze experiment not looking good. I think personally the NIL environment is keeping heat off of some coaches, right? Because now we're in a place with NIL where if you want to buy out a coach, you're digging into the same pockets that pay for players.
True.
So, I think that's one reason that heat has come off of Billy Napier. I think it's one reason the heat's probably turned down a little bit on Sam Pittman. And I think that's one reason that Hugh Freeze isn't facing more heat than whatever he is down on the plains. So, to me, as much as coaches complain about the NIL era, I think in a kind of a twisted way, it brings them a certain amount of job security, depending on the campus, depending on what school and coach you're talking about.
If you're Alabama's coach and you have two options to be your starting quarterback in 2025, Ty Simpson or Jackson Arnold, you're Alabama's coach. Who are you taking to be your starting quarterback this season?
Yeah, that's a great question. Arnold didn't impress me last year as well as he played against Alabama. Mm-hmm. He didn't impress me at all in his first year as a starter at OU. Maybe Hugh Freeze is able to get under the hood and tweak a couple of things with Arnold and turn him into a different quarterback. It's certainly possible. But I wouldn't, to me, I would be just as uncomfortable, if not more so, rolling with a quarterback who just had a bad year at Oklahoma than pulling a new quarterback out of the box, right? Like Ty Simpson. That being said, Jackson Arnold, man, he had a hell of a time behind that offensive line. The OU offensive line was absolutely horrific last year. They patched it together in the transfer portal last offseason. It didn't work out at all. They ended up giving up a ton of sacks, didn't run the ball especially well until Alabama came to town. But to that extent, I give Jackson Arnold a little bit of a pass. But I do think there's some issues that I think there's a good chance he'll go to Auburn and just be Peyton Thorne 2.0.
I don't disagree with you. Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting test. Like, does Hugh Freeze have anything left in the guru tank, right? Like, I mean, a decade ago, this was one of these guys that was walking around as a card-carrying member of Club Guru. He had it right in the wallet, right? I'm sure he could have whipped it out. Guru card right here. Well, they came asking for that back, I think, within the last couple seasons. And this will be the test, I think, with Jackson Arnold. Does he have anything left? Or is Hugh Freeze kind of yesterday's offensive mind? I mean, it's starting to seem like a little bit that whatever magic he had, a decade ago at Ole Miss, it's not kept up, I guess, with the modern sport. And the thing is, like, Hugh Freeze at one time was pretty cutting edge, right? I mean, he helped bring tempo and RPOs into the SEC and forced a lot of people, including Nick Saban, to sort of reevaluate their strategy on offense. But it just seems like hasn't maybe quite kept up with the Joneses, at least in terms of quarterback development anyway.
No, and if you don't think that Hugh Freeze has been left behind a little bit from an X's and O's standpoint, then the only other possibility is he's just picked the wrong horse to ride, right? Peyton Thorne, maybe Jackson Arnold too. We'll see. But it really doesn't matter, right? Either way, it's on Hugh Freeze. If it's X's and O's, it's on Hugh. If it's on recruiting, it's on Hugh, especially when you're talking about that quarterback position, and especially since he's already churned through a couple of OCs at Auburn.
Yeah. All right, let's pivot to the 12-team playoff, Chase, because I'm curious for your thoughts on sort of this year one and the expanded playoff. I'm going to give you my take, and we'll see how much you disagree with what I got, because I wrote a column about a week ago saying, here's what needs to change about the 12-team playoff: nothing. And I know that's not like the fun hot take that I probably should have, but I don't want anything to change. I know there was so much discussion, like, Reese Davis turned the weekly ESPN college football rankings show into like his personal pulpit, demanding that you seed the teams based off the rankings. And I get the logic of that, but I actually don't like the idea of changing it, because I think reserving buys for conference champions preserves value for those conference championship games. If you're not going to give buys to the conference championship, conference champions, I mean, those conference championship games, particularly in the SEC and the Big Ten, become utterly pointless at that point. I also think like buys for conference champions protect a little bit against the committee maybe undervaluing a particular conference throughout the year. That's taken out of the committee's hands a little bit if you give the buys to conference champions. And for all the clamoring about how, well, Arizona State was ranked 12th and seeded 4th, when the game rolled around, Arizona State played closer to a 4 seed than a 12 seed, I thought, in that game against Texas. Now, I don't know that they got all the selections right. I said after the bracket came out, you were on the show after the bracket came out, and I didn't think SMU should be in. I thought the committee whiffed on that one. I thought they overvalued conference runners-up, undervalued a team like Ohio State in seeding. But that's on the committee, I think, to correct. As far as the bracket format, I liked it. I wouldn't change it, particularly, after year one. Let's let it play out for a few years before I'd change it. But you might have a few ideas up your sleeve here. So what are you doing to tinker around with this 12-team playoff?
Yeah, I disagree with you. I think I'm an advocate for the seedings going by the rankings rather than conference championships. But you and I are somewhat on the same page in this respect, because I'm for dumping conference championship games. Wrote about that in December. Matter of fact, when I was on your podcast, like we talked about maybe 6 weeks ago or whatever it was, I think we might have gone down that road at that time. So I won't get back on the soapbox, but
it was a good soapbox. You can play the hits if you want.
I rode one of the wheels off of it, I think. But yeah, I just assume they dump conference championship games. I do think the seedings ought to look, if the 12th best team in the country is landing, or the 11th best team in the country is landing a bye and a 4 seed. Yeah, that's backwards to me. I think that's poor logic on its face. And I don't think we need conference championship games to help settle the rankings or the seedings, because I think the regular season holds up enough. When you're talking about 12 teams, I think the regular season by itself is more than enough to kind of split the hairs that need to be split. And the third best team in the country ought to have the number 3 seed. Period.
My other issue with that, Chase, though, is Notre Dame not playing in a conference championship, then becoming eligible for a bye. They would, in effect, get the double bye. They don't have to play on conference championship weekend, and then if you seed based off ranking, then they could get a bye into the quarterfinals. Maybe some people wouldn't have a problem with that. I think that looks a little fishy when you don't have to play in a conference championship, and then you dump
the conference championship games, and that ain't a problem either. Right?
There we go. It just comes back to dumping those conference championship games, doesn't it? Yeah. Because my other point would be you could finish third in your conference and get a bye while the top 2 teams are playing in the conference championship game. But there again, we just go back to dump the conference championship games. Maybe just and this goes back to what we talked about on the pod 6 weeks ago. I was in the favor of just add an extra week of the regular season, where you said just after the final game, we don't need to add a week of the regular season. Let's just advance the playoffs. But maybe it does all come back to getting rid of that conference championship game. And then with Ohio,
you and I need to launch dumpconferencechampionships.com. Me and you, Blake, we'll do it.
Yeah, we can buy out fireronzook.com, whoever owned the domain for that, and rename it maybe. When you look at Ohio State winning the whole thing, Chase, I thought throughout the entire season, really dating back to the preseason, I thought Ohio State had the most talented team. If I had an AP ballot this year, which I didn't, if I did, I would have voted them number 1 in the preseason. I would have had Ohio State 1, Georgia 2. And then we all know the Michigan loss was perplexing. But in the end, I think the most talented team in the country won the whole thing. However, if this was in the 4-team playoff era, Ohio State wouldn't have been in the playoff because of that loss to Michigan. And so, do you think it's good for the sport that we now have a playoff where, you go 10-2, you suffer a head-scratching loss like Ohio State did, but you're still this team with oodles of talent, that there is a format that can kind of save you, provide you a mulligan, get you in the postseason, you can win the whole thing? Or do you think it was kind of better for the sport before, whereas as good as you are, you might have the most talent in the country, but if you lose to Michigan in your rivalry game, you're out of the playoff? Or in Georgia's case last year, they lost in the SEC championship. They might have been the most talented team in the country. There wasn't room for them. The committee decided in the 4-team playoff, so they got left out in the cold. Which do you think is better for the sport?
Yeah, I was for the 4-team playoff over the BCS. I was for the 12-team playoff over the 4-team playoff. I would not advocate for it to expand any further, but I do like the 12 teams over the 4 teams. And I think it's better for the sport. I mean, for much the same reason that you see pro sports leagues expand playoff formats like we've seen with Major League Baseball, et cetera. And of course, it's been a while now, but there didn't used to be wild cards and the Major League Baseball playoffs. Mm-hmm. They did it to expand interest in more places across the country. It's the same thing. More television, more interest, more everything. I don't think the regular season has been diluted in its importance, which was one of the fears that people had about the 12-team playoff. Certainly, like you said, a 10-2 team can catch a mulligan and still make the playoffs. So, yeah, I mean, if in the 4-team format, if you lost your second game in the regular season, you could forget it. And now you're still in the picture. But again, in terms of interest, that keeps Clemson Nation, Georgia Nation, whatever, it keeps another fan base involved and engaged more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I'm looking ahead to these quote unquote too early rankings for next season, which, by the way, like if we're publishing these rankings, maybe they aren't too early. I don't really understand that too early phrase. But as we look ahead to these too early rankings, like I see teams like Illinois, South Carolina, Kansas State in the top 15. Those teams are billed as playoff contenders. Like, if you're an Illinois fan, do you think you have a chance to win the national championship? Probably not, unless you're crazy. But you do think you got a shot at the playoff, which if it was a 4-team playoff, you probably wouldn't think that, right? I just think, I think you were hitting on this, like it keeps so many more fan bases engaged later into the season, even into the offseason. I think it's been great for the sport. And yeah, I mean, one of the flip sides to that is, when a team like Ohio State loses a perplexing game, they might get a mulligan, but so be it, because I think the upsides outweigh the downsides. And I agree with you. 12 is the right number. I don't think we need to go to 14, even though that might be where it's headed in a couple years' time. So I want to leave you with this, Chase. Get your thoughts on this, and then we'll close. Ohio State, like I said, I thought they just had an unmatchable collection of talent. What they had at wide receiver reminded me of sort of, I guess, 2020 Alabama in a way.
Right.
That collection of skill position talent. Will Howard, we were talking on the pod 6 weeks ago. Is he that dude, or is he just a guy? Well, at times he looked like just a guy. Not in the postseason, though. He became that dude in the postseason. And they played finally up to their potential in the end. But looking back over, let's say, the last 4 national champions to come from the SEC. So that would be 2019 LSU, 2020 Alabama. So with LSU, that was the Joe Burrow team. 2020 Alabama, the aforementioned Mac Jones team with all the talent around him. And then Georgia's back-to-back championship teams under Kirby. We're removing Michigan from this conversation.
Right.
So those 4 champions from the SEC compared to Ohio State, would you favor Ohio State against any one of those teams? Or do you think you'd take the SEC team, neutral field, the whole bit? Would you favor Ohio State against any of them?
If you're asking me if they'd be favored going into a playoff coming off that Michigan loss, I'd say they're not favored over any of them.
Yeah.
If you're talking about the opportunity to make them a favorite or an underdog after they'd blown through 3 playoff games in impressive fashion already, like they did, blowing out Tennessee, looking as good as they did in the playoff leading up to the national championship game. Yeah, I think you probably would favor them over a couple of those teams. Not 2019 LSU. 2019 LSU would have beaten that Ohio State team. I think that was one of the best 5 college football teams I think I've ever seen. Put them right up there with Nebraska, the Nebraska team that blew out Florida, and just as good, I think, as any of Nick Saban's national championships at Alabama. That team was phenomenal. I mean, Joe Burrow was just crazy, crazy good. Ton of receivers. The defensive talent on that team was nuts. But yeah, I think to answer your question more directly, given what we knew about Ohio State's playoff run leading into the final, I think you'd probably make them a favorite over a couple of those teams, but definitely not all of them.
Yeah, I'd probably split it down the middle. I would favor LSU for sure. I think I would favor 2020 Alabama. Strange though that season was, played in the pandemic. That was a great Alabama team, particularly on offense. I think it would have been a really close spread with those Georgia teams. I mean, look, Georgia was great, really for a 3-year run, including last season, but. You go back to the 2022 playoff, that game against the Ohio State team that year came down to the last-second field goal miss by Ohio State. The 2021 Georgia team lost to Alabama in the SEC championship before winning the rematch in the national title game. Stetson Bennett wasn't as good in that 2021 season as he became the next year. So I would have really liked to have seen like this Ohio State team go against one of those 2 Georgia national title teams. I think that would have been a hell of a game. That LSU from 2019 or 2020 Bama, I'm taking the SEC in those games.
Notre Dame just didn't. They just didn't have it. And after after the first drive, I was like, wow, 18 plays, ate up the whole first quarter almost, touchdown. If Notre Dame can run the ball all night, Ohio State's really going to have its hands full. But you tip your hat to Notre Dame for the opening script. You tip your hat to Ohio State for the adjustment. And at the end of the day, Notre Dame had a great punch, but not nearly enough of a counter punch.
Yeah. All right, well, he is Chase Goodbread. You can find all of his columns on Alabama and the SEC over at TuscaloosaNews.com. He'll have some coverage of Alabama's football offseason, of course. And Alabama, as you may know, yes, it's a football podcast, but they got a basketball team too. And Chase has been covering them as well. So pretty good hoop squad that Alabama's got again this year, Chase.
They're looking like they're going to be a low seed again. Yeah, maybe maybe even a 1 seed. Who knows? I mean, it looks a lot like the team 2 years ago that was just crazy deep, crazy talented. They went to the Final Four last year with a team not as talented as the team they have now. So we'll see it. But the whole league is crazy good, right? I mean, the SEC. Not to keep it on basketball too long on a football podcast, but they played that SEC ACC challenge last month where you got all 16 teams from the SEC play 16 teams from the ACC. The SEC went 14-2 in that. I mean, and just blew through the toughest non-conference competition really across the board, not just in that tournament, but throughout the non-conference season. So yeah, it's a hell of an Alabama team, but it's a hell of a lot of competition too.
Yeah, it's snowing in the deep South, and it's the SEC is a basketball league now. We're living in bizarro world, Chase. All right, well, thanks for stopping by on the podcast, and thanks to our listeners. We'll be with you throughout the offseason, covering the developments. Of course, never a dull moment in college football. It really is a 365-day-a-year sport, and we'll be with you throughout on SEC Football Unfiltered. Thanks for listening.